Okay, so let's talk about installing landscape plants. Probably all of you have done this at some point or another, and there's just a few common sense principles to keep in mind. So if you remember, we talked about our sources of plants. We can get them in different forms, and it's going to concentrate on trees. All of these principles that apply to trees would also apply to a shrub that you might be planting, or even maybe a perennial grass, or even our annuals when we set them out. So everything's kind of the same as far as these basic principles go. So one of the forms that we can get plants in is what's called bare root form. These are usually young trees or shrubs that are a couple, 2 or 3 feet high. They don't come with their soil on them. They are dug up and they come what's called bare root, in that their roots are obviously bare. And then when you put them in the ground, you have to keep in mind a couple of things. So one of the things that's really super important to remember is that you need to make sure that where you put it in the ground and leave it as its level, wherever it was in the nursery, it has to be now. If you plant it too deep, you're going to cover up the lenticels and it's going to be hard for the plant to breathe, and you'll probably kill it. If you plant it too high, very obviously it could tip over. And so those are a couple of things that we want to keep in mind. We also want to make the hole fairly big. They usually say a third bigger than the roots themselves. And make sure that you fan the roots out so they're not in a tangled clump. If they're in a tangled clump, then you're going to have a hard time, those roots are going to have a hard time getting enough water. They're only going to get the water from a little area. If you have them fanned out, they collect water from a bigger area, which is really important for a baby plant. Remember that most trees and shrubs have as big a root system down below the surface of the soil as they do structure above the soil. So when they're dug up at the nursery, they really are having a lot of their roots being left right in the nursery or not going to their new home. So that really means that the roots have to be spread out so they can gather as much water as possible. And also, we're going to water that plant deeply a couple times per week. That's what this soil berm is about, because you're going to water this plant, and it will help direct that water down to the roots. The mulch also helps it from being dried out. Just make sure, if you look at this plant really carefully, the mulch is not up to the actual trunk of this baby tree, and that's because it has to breathe. So don't pile mulch next to that. Leave a little space. Now with our balled and burlapped plants, similar deal. Make as big a hole as you can, at least a third bigger than the root ball. These are the plants that come with burlap on them. You want to loosen the burlap, but leave it. Those plant roots are going to grow right through there, and that helps to keep the water around the roots a little bit. The burlap actually disintegrates pretty soon. But again, you want to make sure that your plant is at the same height when you're done as it was at the nursery. They call that and then, just the collar of the plant. Make sure your mulch isn't packed up next to it. Make a berm, water. Your soil should be nice and loose that you put into either one of these, so that the roots have an easy time of growing. You don't want to pack it down. You want to make sure that you get any big rocks out of there. You might also consider putting a little bit of fertilizer in as well. Sometimes we actually will stake the trees. Just make sure that you use something that's not going to bite into the bark and the tree is going to grow around. I think we've all been around in rural Mount Horeb farms and come across an old barbed wire fence where a tree has grown around it. Well, we don't want our staking mechanism to do that. Sometimes we stake, kind of like as a guy wire like this. Sometimes we put the wires out horizontally and then stake on the sides. You especially have to do that if it's a bigger tree, just because that root system is not going to hold up that much structure. And the other thing that we really have to watch for around here is we've got a lot of wildlife damage. We're going to probably wrap the trunk so that rabbits can't eat it. We might put a little fence around it so the deer can't eat it. So we have to kind of keep that in mind as well. Now, with our container plants, everything kind of is the same. We want to make sure we have a big enough hole, water, make the berm, watch out for the mulch up against the trunk. The additional thing that you have to do with container plants is that when you take them out of the container, you take a knife and you score the root ball by making cuts, deep cuts up and down. And that's because the plant will actually grow its roots kind of in a twirl around the inside of the container. And then it continues to do that in the new home. And if you cut that, it encourages the roots to grow out past what its original container was.